by my watch. So we'll begin. Welcome everybody to today's CSSGJ talk. My name is Oliver Dodd and I'm one of the co-directors for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and I'll be chairing today's talk. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor Adam Hanieh. Adam Hanieh is Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and Joint Chair in Middle East Studies at the Institute of International and Area Studies at Tsinghua University, Beijing, China. His current research focuses on oil and capitalism, energy transitions, and the political economy of the Middle East. Today, Adam has published 5 books, 4 single-authored and 1 co-edited, the most recent of which is Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, published by Verso Books in 2024. Adam's third book, Money, Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. The title of today's talk is Petrochemical Blind-Spots, Plastics and Our Warming Planet. As usual, the talk will approximately last 45 minutes and will follow with a similar amount of time for the Q&A. Adam, we're very pleased to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I'm just going to share some slides. Is that visible?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Oliver, and thanks everyone for participating tonight. I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of this work with you and the discussion. As Oliver mentioned, the title of my talk is around the question of petrochemicals, but I wanted to just situate this in its part of the book that Oliver mentioned, Crude Capitalism, and I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes laying out some of the arguments in that book, because it bears on how I've approached this question of petrochemicals and plastics and its relation to the climate emergency. So the book has 13 chapters. It basically aims to present a history of oil situated within a history of global capitalism, within a history of the world market. So it covers different geographies, including the Middle East, as well as Russia, Latin America, and the African continent. It covers these areas in relation to the emergence of the oil industry globally, and in particular, the early 20th century period in which the oil industry was dominated by major Western super majors or major Western oil companies, and then the shift more recently to national oil companies, what I've called NOx there in chapter 12, and this East-East hydrocarbon axis, which is a question that I'm also going to come back to a little bit later in this presentation. So the basic argument of the book is that when we talk about oil, we need to move beyond a kind of a commodity fetishism in much of the discussion of this fossil fuel. And what I mean by that is oil is typically invested with some kind of innate power, some kind of innate social power, divorcing it from the capitalist social relations in which oil is located. So if we think about oil and some of the major writing on oil, a famous one, of course, being a book called The Prize by Daniel Goldman, and a book that was republished many times, but really kind of situates oil in this sense of having its own innate power. Some of the language that we use often to describe oil as a curse, for example, reflects this similar kind of approach. But in the end of the day, oil is simply, as I say in the book, a black sticky goo. And what gives it its power are the various logics of capitalism, and in particular, questions such as the tendency towards endless accumulation of value, the speeding up of the turnover time of capital, the mechanization of industry, these kinds of features, underlying features that typify our social system, and which married with the kind of physical properties of oil, give it this outsized role in our social life. So that's the kind of theoretical framing of the book. It's trying to push back against the kind of commodity fetishism that we see in a lot of discussion of oil, I believe. Connecting to this is the history of the world market through the 20th century up until the current moment. And the major kind of arc of this story is around the rise of American dominance through the first part of the 20th century, the two world wars, really emerging, US emerging as a global power in the middle of the 20th century. And then, as I mentioned, the rise of other parts of the oil industry, and I think what we can argue as the relative decline of American global power in today's world. And these are kinds of themes that I want to come back to as I talk about in more detail around the question of petrochemicals. So a feature of the book that I really am trying to argue here is that we need to move beyond a tendency to just to think about oil in its underground state, in its form of underground subterranean reserves, and think about rather what oil becomes as it circulates through our lives, through the refinery process. It becomes turned into various products, including, of course, transport fuel, but very importantly, other kinds of products like plastics and petrochemicals that I'm going to dig into tonight, but also the ways that oil is connected to the making of global finance through the latter part of the 20th century, US dollar dominance in, again, the 1970s onwards. So to think really about oil beyond its just upstream or upstream form, and to think about what it becomes as it turns into the downstream, which are basically everything that oil becomes after it's pulled out of the ground. And then the other kind of argument that I try to make in the book is that thinking about oil in these kinds of ways can tell us a lot about the nature of energy transitions under capitalism, and essentially that we need to reject, I think, the dominant perspective on energy transitions, which tends to see this transition as being a substitution of one energy source by another, rather than an additive process. So if we look at the history of energy transitions, in particular the so-called coal to oil transition that took place in the middle of the 20th century, what we see here is that oil was added onto coal as an energy source in the middle of the 20th century. It didn't replace coal in that kind of way. And I think that tells us something very much about the nature of this so-called green transition, which is a question, again, I'll come back to at the end of this presentation. So those are some of the key themes. As I mentioned tonight, I want to raise and engage with some of these themes, but particularly in the context of the questions of petrochemicals and plastics. Now, I want to preface this by saying that, as I say in the title of this lecture, that I think this is a blind spot in how we think about the question of fossil fuels. If all of us look around the rooms in which we are sitting tonight, we are essentially surrounded by oil products, whether that be plastics, whether that be synthetic rubber, whether that be the very clothes that we're wearing, which tend to be made of polyesters and synthetic fibers that are ultimately derivatives of oil and gas. If we look at the paints, the fertilizers that supply our foods, all of these kinds of products that are synthetic derivatives of oil, derived from oil as petrochemicals, and really occupy within our lives a really ubiquitous place. Now, this was a historical shift that took place in the middle of the 20th century. It wasn't always like that. These are products that emerged at that moment and really supplanted naturally occurring substances like wool, like cotton, like wood, like steel, like materials that were naturally derived, and adding on to them these products, these kinds of synthetic products. Now, one of the arguments I try to make in this book is that identifying and learning to see this synthetic transformation is a really crucial part of dealing with the climate emergency that we're currently living, because what the rise of these synthetic products did was it essentially made oil invisible. We don't tend to think about oil's pervasive location in our daily lives. We tend to reduce oil simply to a liquid transport fuel. So learning to see oil, this pervasive nature of oil, really shining a light and making oil visible, I think is a key challenge to understanding the real intractable nature of fossil fuels in capitalism. Now, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, this shift that took place in the middle of the 20th century was a fundamental part of the broader coal to oil transition, in which oil emerged in around 1950 as the principal fossil fuel. And what this did was it made there are a couple of reasons why it was so crucial to this coal to oil transition. Firstly, what it did was it really reinforced the power of oil companies in our daily lives, because oil companies were no longer simply producing liquid fuels. Through the refining process, the waste in the refining process, essentially the waste products of the refining process, became turned into useful products, these petrochemicals, that came to underlie basically all of material commodity production. So in this sense, oil moved beyond and oil companies, the power of oil companies extended much further than simply a supplier of these of liquid fuels. And this, I think, is a really important part of thinking about the kinds of questions that we often hear about in the media, read about in the newspapers and so forth today around the toxic effects of plastics and other kinds of petrochemicals, and trying to reframe this as a question of fossil fuels and their place in capitalism, rather than simply a question of recycling or dealing with these kinds of toxic effects. And again, this is a question I want to return to a little bit later. So having set that kind of broader narrative, I want to speak now a little bit about some of the concrete history of how these products emerged, and then think about the structure of the petrochemical industry today, and what that might mean for dealing with the climate catastrophe. So how do we understand this moment, this post-war, middle of 20th century moment with the rise of the petrochemical industry? Essentially, there are through the early part of the First World War and the middle of the early part of the 20th century, the global chemical industry was very much linked or very much dominated by German companies, in particular a chemical trust called IG Farben, which was bringing together various German chemical companies and were fundamentally linked to Hitler and to the Nazi rise of the Nazis in Germany through the 1930s. The fundamental feature of the German chemical industry was that it was coal-based. In other words, the chemicals that were produced by IG Farben and the industry more broadly were derivatives of coal. And at this moment, the German chemical industry was by far the largest in the world, dominating the industry in the United States and more broadly throughout Europe. What happened, however, in the 20th century, and this is a story I go through in some detail in the book, is that we see a shift in both the structure of the global chemical industry, in which the German industry is basically destroyed throughout the war, and the American state provides enormous backing to U.S. oil companies to become and to emerge as the biggest petrochemical firms globally. So we see a shift both in terms of the dominance of from German to American chemical companies, in particular American oil companies, and secondly, we see a shift in the basic substrate that is the derivative of which these is how these chemicals are derived, away from coal towards oil as the basic material producing these petrochemicals. As I said, what this meant is that the materiality of commodity production becomes a derivative of the production of energy, in this case, the production of oil, reinforcing and really supplementing the strength of these big American firms, such as what we know today, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and these other big Western oil producers. Now, through the 1950s and 1960s, what happened? This shift in the kind of materiality of commodity production played a major role in shifting the nature of capitalist production more broadly, because what it did was it decoupled the production of commodities from nature itself. There was no longer this fundamental tie to natural products such as those I mentioned earlier, and instead the emergence of these synthetic products helped to not only reduce the time required, in other words, the turnover time of capitalist production through things like injection molding machines, through thermoplastics, which are plastic pellets basically that can be molded into various products very simply, heated and molded into various products. And this both created a huge increase in the variety of products that were able to be produced under capitalism, as well as removed the limits on the quantity of commodity production at this stage, and this is really, I think, a crucial point to highlight, in the sense that the ubiquity of plastics and petrochemicals more broadly was deeply connected to these fundamental features in the logics of capitalism as this system of endless accumulation. I want to just mention one author here, I think, who needs much more attention by those of us who are interested in these questions of ecology, questions of Marxism, questions of the left, and that is a US ecologist, Barry Commoner, who was really, I think, a pioneer in highlighting these tendencies that I'm discussing here in the 1970s, really identifying the significance and quite prescient in his analysis of their effects on both society and also the environment from the vantage point of the 1970s. This is the post-war rise of the petrochemical industry. Again, just to highlight, we see the shift away from German to American dominance. This was part of the war, the destruction of the German chemical industry, and immediately, actually before the war ended, actually what the US military did in Germany was to send chemical company and oil company officials, drafted them into the army, sent them into conquered parts of Germany to basically appropriate the industrial secrets of the chemical industry. So one prominent historian has called this the war booty, basically the greatest war booty in history, was this emergence of this American dominated petrochemical industry. Now, this, as I said, really revolutionized the nature of, I think, capitalist production more broadly. It made a whole set of industries basically underpinned by these new synthetic products, whether it be agriculture and the place of fertilizers and pesticides in agriculture, whether it be the automobile industry and the ways in which cars essentially became plastic vehicles, whether it became the clothing industry, the fashion industry, which again is essentially an industry of oil products. The clothes that we wear are by a majority synthetic fibers, plastic fibers that are these derivatives of oil. And I just would highlight the question of the this turn or its effect on the fashion industry. I think it's interesting to think about in the contemporary moment the question of fast fashion, which I'm sure many of you here today have heard about this concept, the idea that the fashion industry globally today is linked to a very fast turnover in fashion styles, huge increase in the volume of clothing that's being produced, the ability to very quickly switch styles, micro seasons it's called, and this kind of change to the fashion industry was predicated on the availability of these synthetic fibers to really increase in a huge volume the amount of clothing that could be produced. Obviously, another side to this that has received a lot of attention is the kind of sweatshop model of global clothing production. But the question or the fact that this is really connected to the rise of the petrochemical industry as well, I think has not received as much attention that is needed. Now, you see here on this slide, Fortune magazine, and this is a 1950 edition of Fortune magazine, really kind of identifies this moment, calling it the chemical century, with the rise of these firms. It was primarily an industry that was dominated by American oil firms, the biggest of the American oil firms, and these were vertically integrated firms. So they weren't simply concerned with the extraction of crude oil. but they controlled the refining process, they controlled petrochemical plants, and they controlled the marketing of these petrochemical products. So the vertical integration of the oil industry was very much associated with this this emergence of petrochemicals, and this is an important point in terms of understanding the corporate structure of oil firms today. Now, there was another side to this. In the United States, there was these industries tended to be located in racialized communities that were suffering from the Jim Crow arrangements, marginalized ex-slave communities. And this is why today we see the location of these petrochemical plants. In particular, there's an area called Cancer Alley stretching in which the majority of the U.S. petrochemical production takes place, continuing to be located in these racialized and marginalized communities, because in these areas, land could be taken cheaply. And the concerns of pollution and the toxic effects of chemical production could essentially be ignored because of the histories of slavery in these kinds of areas. So there's very much a connection of how the chemical industry and the physical and spatial location of the petrochemical industry was connected to these earlier histories of oppression within the United States. Now, this kind of American dominance, the connection to the vertically integrated oil firms, was a feature of the industry that lasted and continues to be evident through today. However, what has happened in the last decade or so is the rise of new actors in the oil and petrochemical industry. And this is a really important, I think, element to understand when we're thinking about these questions today. Essentially, over the last 2 decades, we have seen the emergence of huge national oil companies located in the Middle East, in particularly in the Gulf states of the Middle East, the Gulf monarchies. Saudi Arabia really stands out here, as well as petrochemical firms and oil firms located in China and the wider East Asia region. Now, these firms, you'll see on the slide, Saudi Aramco. This is Saudi Arabia's national oil company. It is by far the largest oil company in the world today. Its combined profits in last year exceeded the combined profits of the 5 biggest Western oil companies. So we're talking here about ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, and Total Energies. These 5 Western oil firms, their combined profits were less than the profits of Saudi Aramco. Now, Saudi Aramco is majority owned by the Saudi state. A small part of it is also listed on the Saudi stock market. But what is significant here is that these national oil companies located in the Gulf and elsewhere have basically followed the same pattern as the Western companies that I described earlier, in the sense that they have become vertically integrated. They are no longer simply producers of crude oil. They are also very much connected to the refining industry. They control transport links, they control tanker fleets, they control pipelines, and they control the production of plastics and petrochemicals. In fact, Saudi Aramco is now the owner of the 2nd biggest synthetic rubber company in the world. And it is the owner of the 3rd or 4th biggest petrochemical company in the world as well. So we can see that these firms have gone downstream. They are no longer, we can no longer simply think of them as crude oil, only as crude oil producers. Now, there's another very important aspect to this, which is connected to how, and it helps us understand why these firms have grown so immensely over the last decade or so, and why they have been able to move in this downstream diversification. And that is a fundamental shift in the nature of the oil industry, in which the main kind of axis of the global oil trade today is between the Middle East and China, East Asia. This is something that's new. If we look back in the early 2000s, about half of the world's oil trade went to the US and Western Europe. Today, China alone consumes around a fifth of the world's oil imports. And most of this, the majority of this, comes from the Middle East. So there's been an eastward shift in the Middle East oil exports away from the US and Western Europe towards China and the wider East Asian region. Now, this eastward shift is not simply the export of crude oil. It is also involved the export of refined products and such as petrochemicals. So if we look at, for example, the global trade in basic plastics, we can see here China very clearly leads the world in the importing of these two fundamental chemicals that basically underlie all of the products that I've discussed, the kinds of synthetic fibers and so forth that I've discussed. And we can see that there is the largest share of China's imports of these basic chemical products come from the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates in particular. So the point I'm making here is that this east-east hydrocarbon circuit, as I've described it, is not simply the export of crude oil. It is also the export of refined products eastward to China and elsewhere. So these interdependencies that we're seeing forming between the Middle East and China extend beyond simply upstream crude oil into the downstream sectors. Now, it also has involved the increasing flows of capital, again, between these two regions. So those petrochemicals firms you see listed here, Rongsheng, Hengli, and so forth, these are the largest privately owned petrochemical firms in China, and all of them have ownership shares from the Gulf, in particular from Saudi Arabia. So we see these interdependencies form through flows of capital between the two regions, in which the Gulf investments, Gulf capital, are located inside Chinese production circuits, inside China itself. This extends beyond simply China. South Korea, a very important center also of global petrochemical production. You can see, for example, S-Oil, that company that's mentioned there. It's a South Korean firm that is one of the largest petrochemical firms in South Korea. It's actually building the largest petrochemical complex cracking refinery now at the moment. S-Oil is a fully owned subsidiary of Saudi Aramco, that company I mentioned earlier. So we can see how these interdependencies stretch into major other East Asian petrochemical industry as well. And likewise with Malaysia and Japan, these firms have very close connections to the Gulf, including joint investment structures. So, as I said, this has meant the vertical integration of these Gulf-based oil companies, so that they now encompass petrochemical production. If we look at some of the largest plants that are underway at the moment globally. They are located in Saudi Arabia, for example. What is interesting here is that the major oil companies are identifying petrochemicals as basically the lifeline of the oil industry. The future of oil is explicitly how they describe these products. So what we see underway at the moment, for example, in Saudi Arabia, is a massive crude oil to chemicals complex, which will be the largest in the world. This is a new kind of technology that directly converts crude oil into chemicals. And it's expected to launch this year in 2025. Aramco, the Saudi national oil company, is aiming for about 40% of its oil to be converted into petrochemicals by 2035. So we really see here the way in which petrochemicals have been identified as the kind of lifeline of the industry, the fossil fuel industry more broadly, moving forward. In the case of any kind of reduction in oil's use as a transport, as simply as a liquid fuel. I'll come back to this question at the end. So, of course, all of this, as we well know, is connected to a whole range of ecological consequences. Some of these statistics that I have here, I think, are really staggering and really show the way in which these synthetic products have become embedded in capitalist production in really very structural and deep ways. A 200-fold increase in plastics production between 1950 and 2015. Over half of all plastics that have ever been produced have been produced in the last 25 years. And that number is expected to double again by 2050. So we see this ever accelerating ways in which plastic products have become really ubiquitous and have underpinned the ever accelerating production of commodities more generally under capitalism. Now, as we know, the dominant discussions around this is to see, to call for recycling, but the reality is that this is a smokescreen. I think we can frankly say less than 10% of plastics that are produced are recycled. Most plastics are what are called mismanaged. In other words, they end up leaking into the environment, and that volume of mismanaged plastics is estimated to double again by 2050. Sorry, that should be 2050 there. Now, as we see, anyone who opens The Guardian every day, there's a story of the toxic consequences of these plastics, microplastics, nanoplastics, whether they are found in the brain, in the blood, the placenta. It's the new studies coming out almost daily, talking about how these products lodge within our bodies, and crucially, the kinds of chemicals that are associated with plastic production that give them their malleability, for example, or their fire inflammability, these kinds of things. These chemicals that are plastics are basically the carriers of these toxic chemicals like PFAS, and they have very damaging consequences both for humans and the wider environment. One of the things, though, I think that's often not widely acknowledged is that these products also have broader climate impacts beyond their simple toxic effects, in the sense that the ways in which plastics and microplastics, nanoplastics lodge in, for example, the ocean, disrupts the ability of these carbon sinks to actually function. The ocean is a critical carbon sink, and the lodging of microplastics and nanoplastics in the ocean directly directly impacts the ability of the ocean to capture carbon in the way that it does in natural cycles. Similarly, the production of petrochemicals themselves is a major source of carbon emissions in itself. So we see that when we're thinking about the petrochemical industry, it's not simply the toxic consequences of the products that are produced. It's not simply the ways in which it reinforces and feeds the consumption of oil more generally and the strength of oil companies more generally. It's also the direct climate impact through the production of greenhouse gases and their effects on carbon sinks. So I think thinking about this in these kind of multiple ways is really crucial in terms of understanding the ways in which these products are connected to climate change. So just to wrap up, what I want to, the argument that I'm trying to make here tonight, but also I think in the book very much is that we need to reframe these questions of plastics, petrochemicals, the toxic questions of these products as not simply a byproduct of inadequate recycling or focusing just on their consequences to the environment, but actually understand their connection to a fossil fuel and particularly oil-driven global capitalism. This is it is what these products do for capitalism that explain their ubiquity and the ever-accelerating increase in their production. So, as I've said, oil companies see this as the lifeline of oil production, and we can see here this graph, I think, is very stark in the sense that it shows the ways in which the energy transitions. You can see in the 1950s that the real orange line really takes off, and that really explains the massive increase in the total energy consumption globally. This is the moment of this coal to oil transition. It's the moment of the petrochemical revolution. But we also see very starkly here that there is no decline in the consumption of oil, coal, or gas, the three major fossil fuels, over the last, since that moment of the 1950s. In fact, last year, the production of coal, oil, and gas were at record levels, despite the fact that renewables and other energy sources were also being produced at growing amounts. So, this is the point I was making earlier, that energy transitions need to be thought of as additive and not substitutive. And the place of petrochemicals in this, and plastics more generally, is really important to thinking about the future of growing oil consumption. The last point that I'll make is that, as I've spent some time discussing, we need to think, I think, very much about the role of national oil companies in this industry today. What I've said is not at all to say that the Western companies are not important, ExxonMobil and those other firms, but they tend to be more focused in the North American markets, in the Western European markets, and not so much in that kind of east-east hydrocarbon axis that I spoke to. And what we see associated with the rise of these national oil companies is that they have taken a very prominent role in international climate discussions. We see this, for example, in the COP processes, in the COP28 discussions, for example, which was presided over by the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and convened in Dubai a couple of years ago. So we see it in the wider climate discussions, but we also see it in the questions and discussions around plastics. So last year, November 2024, there was an important meeting that was held in Busan in South Korea. It was to sign a global plastics treaty. with the goal of limiting global production of plastics. And it was very striking that at that meeting in South Korea, it was Saudi Aramco that essentially led the opposition to any curbs on global plastics production. And the argument, and this I think is very revealing, the argument that Saudi Arabia made in advocating against these kinds of limits was that the problem, and this is a quote, the problem of plastics is a problem of recycling, not a problem of production. That I think is a very revealing point, and it actually we need to flip that argument on its head and really kind of locate, I think, these products within the production, within the nature of capitalist production. Yeah, so I'm going to end it there. If you are interested in the book, Verso have offered a 40% discount. If any of you would like to pick a copy, you just need to order it from Verso Books online with the discount code CRUDE. But thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you. I'll stop my sharing of the screen now.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. That was a really insightful and systematic talk. Really helped me to understand much more about the role that oil plays in the world. So thank you very much for that. We'll be moving on to the Q&A now. We've got about 40 minutes for a Q&A, which people can ask questions via the chat, or they can ask questions via video and audio. So who would like to go first? I see Robin Fossil, if you'd like to ask your question. Sorry, just unmuting you. Apologies for that.
Okay, is it working? It is.
There we go.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk, Adam. I'm the director of an organisation that works to disrupt the fossil fuel industry in London, and we're called Fossil Free London. And what we often get as pushback is exactly what you described, that so much of our, of what we use, the pen I'm using, the phones we use to record our disruptions of BP or Shell events are made of oil. And I wonder, as someone who works on this extensively, if you found a compelling answer. We like to point to the fact that supply is not a neutral process, and that the oil industry obviously produces the demand and then matches it with supply, that they corrupt governments, create plans. They did it in COVID. The Drilled podcast is quite useful for some of that. But I wondered your view, and if there's a way to sort of put down that criticism through describing, obviously what's happening through the capitalist process in those companies themselves. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I take a few questions, Oliver? Or
what would you prefer?
Yeah, sure. That would be good if there are other questions. Yeah.
Further questions at the moment? We haven't got any in the chat, I don't believe, but if anyone else would like to ask a question. If not, I do have one. Well, I will abuse chair's privileges to ask a question myself. I'm just wondering, Adam, the extent to which today oil producing powers have the ability to really change the price of oil at the push of a button. So when states like Saudi Arabia decide to significantly increase or hold back their petroleum, which states can make a difference to the price significantly, essentially at the push of a button.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll deal with those couple of questions first. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I mean that is really the push you've identified. I mean, I get that comment all the time as well, and I think the way you've kind of framed this as the question of demand is a good one. The other point is that there are ways of limiting, I think, the kinds of products that are produced that are essentially not, there's no need for this massive increase in doubling of plastics production, for example. There are alternative ways, alternative substances and materials that can be used, and this of course connects with the debates around degrowth, I think, in real very real ways. But I do think we do have to raise this question of capitalism, because I don't think under the capitalist mode of production that there is any real way of tackling this problem, to be frank, because of the ways or what these products actually do for capitalism. So we need to be obviously talking about this in ways that are, reach understandable, but I do think we need to talk about them in ways that are anti-capitalist, because there are the possibility of substituting other kinds of materials rather than oil and gas to produce petrochemicals, but that requires research. It requires retooling and reshaping the ways we live and the ways we produce in fundamental ways. So if we are going to do that, and we really have to do that, given the immensity of the problem, we do need to I think situate this as a problem of capitalism. So yeah, I'm not, of course, I think the various campaignings and wins that can be achieved in the here and now are important parts of building that, and I think the questions of the global treaties and stuff are feed into that, but I do think it needs to be connected to a broader anti-capitalist politics. Oliver, yes, thanks for that question. And it's a really important one, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what the ways that oil is priced, to be honest, in the sense that for most of the history of oil, up until about, we can be very precise on this, 1985, but up until that moment, the price of oil was essentially determined by the producers. It was set administratively by the major producers. So for most of the 20th century, those major producers were those big Western oil firms that I spoke about, ExxonMobil and so forth, that basically controlled most of the world's oil, including its extraction, and they could set the price of oil. After the establishment of OPEC, the big oil producing states like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela had much more of an impact in setting that administrative price of oil. However, what happened in the mid-1980s is that there was a shift in the way that oil is priced onto financial markets. In particular, there are two major markets here, the WTI, West Texas Intermediate, which is an oil financial market in the US, and then Brent, which I'm sure everyone here has heard about, which is European located one. Now, what is critical to understand here is that on these financial markets, what is sold are oil futures. So it's basically a contract for the delivery of oil at some point in the future. And that is what we commonly hear today as the price of oil. So when we hear that oil is $70 a barrel, it's not the fact that buying a barrel of oil is going to cost $70. It's that the oil future that's the price of the oil future, according to the oil futures. So this is really important because it means that the price of oil is set in financial markets, not by those big producers. It's not OPEC, it's not ExxonMobil, it's whatever. Now, so we have these two parallel processes going on at the same time. The control of oil, the production of oil, its supply by the oil companies, and then the involvement of firms. They might be financial firms like hedge funds and private equity firms. They might be large consumers of oil like airliners or tanker companies or whatever it might be. Or it might be oil companies themselves who invest and speculate and hedge in these financial markets. And the flows of capital into these financial markets is what moves the price of oil. So it's financially set. Now, that's important because we often hear OPEC has decided that they're going to produce X amount of barrels of oil or cut back on producing, and that's going to shift the price of oil. Now, obviously, people take this kind of news, OPEC declarations and Saudi Arabia and henceforth into consideration in their investments on these financial markets, but there's not a direct correspondence between those declarations and the price of oil. It's mediated through these financial markets. So that's a really important shift that took place in the mid-1980s. So your question of what kind of drives it, it might be, Saudi Arabia has an immense power in all of this because they are, Saudi Aramco is the largest exporter of oil. So that its decision, and it has the capacity to ramp up supply that other producers may not have. So that it's important. That's why Saudi Arabia is so important within OPEC. But it might be a war, it might be a global recession. All of these factors also impact these financial flows and therefore the kind of movement of futures on the oil financial markets. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Adam. That's great. Let's have another round of questions then. Elif, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask the first one?
Thank you, Adam. I really thought that it was a thought-provoking presentation. I especially like your reference to reframe it as fossil fuel-driven global capitalism. My question is more about the recent coordinates of ownership in the oil petrochemical industries, especially after the 2008 Great Recession. You talked a bit about it in the, I think, as an answer to Oliver's question, but I'm curious whether it goes further to this line of concentration of capital, for instance, among these big companies, or is it like, because you also talked about nationalization, especially in the case of Saudi Arabia and the East. And based on that recent coordinates or dynamics of capital ownership, how is this reflected on the debates on imperialism? In terms of, do we see really a rise of inter-imperial rivalry? Or is it like more a transnational capitalist class around these oil petrochemical industries operating on the global economy? I was just curious about your reflections on that. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Andy?
Yeah, the book is tremendous and you should be congratulated. It's a real tour de force. It's very broad scope and it does cover, it really does explain an awful lot of things. And I got a question and a comment that the invitation is, could you say a bit more about how petrochemicals fitted with the sort of US dominance in that sort of post-Second World War period? Because exactly what we've just been talking about is the sort of, how did oil money help US imperialism? Because the book deals with that very well, I think, right? And my question is, could you say something more specifically about UK oil companies? Because it's connected with a couple of the earlier questions. And I do appreciate the sort of, you need to follow sort of changes in the world oil industry. but British imperialism has a very particular sort of niche, including actually this whole thing about the East-East axis. I mean, there's a naval base in Oman, which is of the British Navy, set up, launched by one Prince Andrew. And they, they're very attentive to the Straits of Malaga and Singapore. So there's this whole sort of like military tension building up in terms of these sort of routes of oil transport, which I think should be included in the discussion of sort of imperialist rivalry that's quite rightly been raised. So, I mean, there's an awful lot more to comment about your book, which, I say it raises an awful lot of very, very interesting points.
Adam?
Okay. Yes, sure. Thank you for that, and thanks for those kind words, Andy. So maybe I'll begin with Elif's question. So I mentioned that this shift that took place, obviously associated with the rise of China as a major center of global manufacturing from the early 2000s onwards. The emergence of China as this kind of center of global production and wider industrial growth required a huge increase in oil supplies and fuel more generally, as well as the kind of petrochemical and refined products that I've spoken about. So it wasn't simply a shift, a zero-sum game, that there was a shift away from Western Europe and North America to China. It was associated with a huge increase in the global consumption of oil. This change in the world market that took place through those first 2 decades of the 21st century. Now, the other thing, this did a couple of things. One, it was partly connected to a rise in the price of oil. Now, I answered, in my answer to Oliver's question earlier, I made the point that we can't simply see the price of oil as a consequence of demand and supply. It's to do with the place of these financial markets. But China's demand really accelerating demand did impact and help to encourage speculative flows of capital into these markets. So there was a large increase in the price of oil that lasted up till about the 2008 crisis. And what this did was that it incentivized shale production in North America. It made these kinds of more expensive forms of oil extraction more profitable, and really a lot of this is why the U.S. U.S. oil markets really expanded in that period. So the U.S. is the largest oil producer in the world today. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's the United States. And it's to do with this shale revolution. So 2008, the global recession, of course, there's a drop in the demand for oil. Following that, one of the only few drops globally historically in the last 80 or so years, where there's been an annual decline. In the other major declines have been obviously in COVID, and with the 1980-82 recession was actually the largest drop in oil consumption in history. So otherwise, oil consumption has been increasing. So so this is kind of setting that 2008 kind of in context, I guess. But to come to the question of looking at these ownership structures, how they might fit into kind of inter-imperial rivalries or great power rivalries. So firstly, let me deal with this question of oil nationalization in places like Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Aramco, as I said, is controlled by the Saudi government. However, as I mentioned, there's a small amount that is listed on the Saudi Stock Exchange. And what this has done is it provides a route of capital accumulation for large Saudi conglomerates, capital conglomerates, and within the Gulf more broadly, who can basically buy Saudi Aramco stocks and therefore profit through dividends and other means from the expansion of the oil industry and the real central role of this big company globally. So one of the things I try to argue in the book is that we shouldn't see a contradiction between state ownership in places like Saudi Arabia or in Russia and private capital accumulation. Very often, it's actually through the state ownership that we see this accumulation of private capital encouraged. So that's how I think we should see how we should see these knocks. However, and if we look in the Western markets like ExxonMobil and look at their ownership structures, there we see the big asset management firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street, private equity firms, these kinds of big capital management who are the predominant shareholders of those Western firms. So again, and these are also the actors, by the way, that are investing in the financial oil futures on the financial markets. So we see this these ownership structures in both the financial sector as well as the physical ownership of oil, or the actual physical production of oil. So how does this shift play? And this kind of connects also to Andy's point about thinking about the Gulf and its place in all of this. I think these East-East interdependencies that I spoke about are very real, and they have been associated with growing interdependencies between China and the Gulf in all sectors beyond hydrocarbons. However, the Gulf states are still predominantly under the umbrella, military umbrella of the United States, and they are predominantly connected to US financial markets. So there is this kind of tension that has emerged in the last 10 years or so, where we see on one hand the kind of oil industry, the export markets and so forth orientating eastward, but on the other hand, the historic connection between Western imperial interests, principally the US, I'll come to the UK in a second, still the major allies of those Gulf producers. And I think this goes a long way to explaining the current genocide in Palestine, to be clear, because what the United States is trying to do at the moment is to knit together its two major pillars of power historically in the Middle East, which has been on one side Israel, and on the other side the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, through normalizing relationships between these two powers and reassert American primacy in the region and pull the region away from its connections with the East, with China in particular. And this is important in the context of any possibility of a war or sanctions, control of those oil flows, and also control of the petrodollar surpluses that come with the sale of oil will be a big kind of a factor in the prognosis of any kind of conflict. So I do think thinking about this in terms of these rivalries are really very much, we can learn a lot through thinking about these states and their place in these rivalries. Just to come on to, so, I mentioned this is not just about the physical sale of oil, the Gulf's place in American power. Andy has made the point or raised the question about, in the 1970s, when oil was nationalized in the Gulf, these states accumulated trillions of dollars through the sale of oil. And those dollars were invested primarily in Western financial markets, including US Treasury bonds and US equity markets and so forth. So the kind of American financial dominance was closely connected to the recirculation of those petrodollars from the Gulf into American markets. The other very important venue or place in which these petrodollar surpluses were invested was the City of London. And this connects to the historic role that British imperialism played in the Gulf region prior to American dominance in the region after the World War II. So the early 20th century, it was Britain firstly, and then France to a second degree, but primarily Britain that was the major imperialist force in the Middle East region, and particularly in the Gulf region. So this is why, and he's absolutely right, we can't kind of forget about the place of Britain in this kind of bigger architecture of Western imperialism, whether it be bases in the Gulf states, whether it be the sale of weapons, which is another route of petrodollar recycling into the Western markets. Britain, the Gulf is the largest consumer of military imports in the world, and most of those military sales come from the US, the UK, and France. They are the biggest suppliers. So again, I think those points are very important. And of course, yeah, just on terms of UK oil companies, I mean, BP and Shell remain within those big Western firms. And it's very clear in the last couple of years that any talk about these companies moving away from fossil fuel production have been completely jettisoned. They've doubled down on oil production and gas production.
Really interesting. Thank you, Adam. I can see Andreas has his hand up, but I've also got a question in the chat. So I'll read out the question in the chat first. The UK produces around, this is by Alfred Chinter, the UK produces around 30% of its electricity needs from fossil fuels, oil, and its uses majorly for transport. However, the transition to electric cars should significantly change that. Do you think the move away from plastics for purposes, for various purposes, for example, packaging, lubricants, might be more difficult to solve in the capital market system, as it can be consistently made clearer to undercut the alternatives of plastics as they are products of oil production? Andreas?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adam, for the fascinating presentation. Very quick question. Where does Russia and Russian oil come into these discussions, and how important is Russian oil in the world market?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And gas, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer those questions?
Yep, that's
Oliver?
all
Yep.
we've got. Yep.
Okay. So first on this, the electric cars, electric vehicles. Yeah, I mean, they're one of the. I think in the last chapter of the book, I talk about what I describe as kind of false solutions to the climate crisis. And I think one of those is the REVs, in the sense that what matters when thinking about uses of fuel is it's not the relative share of particular fuels, it's the absolute production of fossil fuels. So it may be the case, although I think I'm very skeptical that this is really going to happen in any substantial way. There may be a case that, we transition away from a internal combustion engine towards EVs at a global scale. And, there's a drop in the decline or consumption of petrol and liquid transport fuels. But what matters is that graph I showed at the end. It's not so much the relative share of oil and gas and these other products, it's the overall production. So it's quite possible that the relative share of oil might decrease or stay stable. However, at the same time, that doesn't preclude the absolute increase in the production of these fossil fuels, if the overall energy sector is doing what it has done historically, which is grow, grow, grow. So that's the point. And if that happens, then it doesn't really matter, because it actually means that the climate crisis is going to accelerate, because we're seeing ever increasing production of fossil fuels, even if its relative share is dropping. So I think that's important to think about in terms of these transitions. And I mean, not to mention the fact that the EV growth is really, I mean, globally, it's really in China where that's happening. And in China, there's also an increasing production of coal-fired electricity. So you might be shifting away from liquid petroleum, but at the same time you're charging your cars with coal-fired electricity. Again, it's not a solution, a sustainable solution. So yeah, that's but and then the second part of your question about plastics, etc. Yeah, I do think the kind of as I said, I think earlier, this kind of capital, the ways in which capitalism drives these kinds of consumption habits makes it very difficult to see any kind of shift away from plastics in this social system, as I said earlier. Andreas's question about Russian oil. Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things to point out here. One is that there has been a kind of eastward shift also in the Russian oil trade towards China, and it's an important kind of supplier of oil to China. Not more than the Middle East, but there has been an increase over the last few years. However, and here is where I think it's important to think about kind of the downstream and the structure of the downstream industry. What has happened is that there may not be direct Russian oil or exports into Europe, but what we do see is that a lot of Russian oil is going to Turkey and India in particular, and either getting mixed with other kinds of oil and then imported by Europe, or refined and then getting imported by Europe as a refined product coming from India and Turkey and elsewhere. So it's not like I don't think there's been a significant decline in that sense, looking at the ways that these refined these third country ways of getting Russian oil into Europe. So, Russian oil is very important. Historically, as I talk about in the book, it's been a critical feature of the kind of political economy of Russia, both in the early days of the 1917 revolution and following, and also with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Putin. It basically, it's been the sale of oil globally has been a major part of the kind of underpinning of the Russian state throughout that period.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. We've got time for a couple more questions, quick questions. Have we got any? I've got one at least. Andreas, yeah.
Just a quick point, very different from the before. I came across a social media post today where it said that an US oil company had sued Greenpeace successfully, endangering, at least in US, Greenpeace very existence. So I thought it was quite interesting that despite their dominance, that there does seem to be this concern about any kind of contestations of the dominance of oil, and so that there's also clear moments of class struggle over the role of oil, what's happening, and these corporations seem to invest heavily into that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I hadn't heard about this particular development, but I do think it's clear that there is this you know, and they're using this moment, I think, with the ascendance of Trump to really go after activists in these kinds of ways.
IPEC?
Thank you, Adam. It's a really fascinating presentation. I also admire your work, your previous work on migration. I just wanted to ask several of my questions has already been answered, but I just wanted to ask you how the rise of these national oil companies and then Saudi Arabia becoming an investor into production as well as finance is affecting the relations between the rulers and the ruled in the Gulf area. So there was this phenomenon of rentier state in terms of explaining those relations. Would you consider that to be relevant still? What about, like, what can we say about the oppressors and the oppressed in the Gulf area? What are the implications?
I'll just add to that, I don't know, a final question. To bring it all together, then, it looks fairly, the outlook looks fairly negative, you know, going forward. And I just wonder what your final reflections are on the outlook and the solutions. Is it really, you know, are we just heading inevitably towards barbarism and oblivion, or is, you know, because it looks like that in terms of the way we're going based on your assessment. I just wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Okay. Thanks for those, and again, thanks for all of the great questions that you've offered tonight. IPEC, yeah, I mean, this is a really important point about thinking of the social structures of the Gulf monarchies and their nature as capitalist states. And I think what is really important to emphasize here is that in all of these states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other Gulf monarchies, there's 6 of them altogether. These states are ruled by hereditary monarchies. Their kind of structure is dominated by large capitalist conglomerates that straddle many different kinds of activities, from, you know, construction through to retail through to financing. Also, they're very diversified conglomerates. These conglomerates are in part owned by influential private individuals, non-ruling family members, as well as members of the ruling family who are operating in a private capacity. So again, we need to think about kind of the state-private boundaries, not as being dichotomous, but actually as being very closely connected to one another. And you can have the state, individuals in the state who operate in this private in this private capacity. So that's the kind of capital structure of capital, if you like. And you know, these firms these conglomerates are closely connected to the state. They get supported by state investments. They win state contracts. They enter into joint ventures with Aramco and other kind of state-owned firms. All of those kinds of things. So again, supported by the state. But the other side to this, of course, is the labor structure, which is here you have a majority of the working class in the Gulf that are non-citizen migrant workers. So in each of these Gulf states, more than 50% of the labor force is made up of non-citizen migrant workers. And these migrant workers are, there's no route to citizenship, no kind of viable route to citizenship. And at times of crisis, like we saw in 2008, these workers can simply be deported, put on a plane and sent home. And that's exactly what happened in places like Dubai and elsewhere. So in this sense, what happens at these moments of crisis is these migrant workers are sent home, and the crisis itself, or at least a large substantial proportion of the crisis, the economic impact of the crisis, is displaced onto those labor sending areas in India, Bangladesh, the Middle East, further afield. That's where the effect is felt. So it's this kind of overcoming of crisis through this displacement of migrant labor is a very important feature of these states. And of course, in these states, labor activity by these migrant workers is completely banned. Anytime there are strikes or protests, the leaders can simply be deported, legally deported. So, that's the structure. So I think, in my opinion, the kind of rentier state framework doesn't capture adequately the kind of class nature of these Gulf states. Again, it invests oil with this kind of determining power without thinking about the ways in which oil is situated in class and social relations. So yeah, and maybe just finally on Oliver's, yes, I mean, I do think, I mean, this question, we often speak about socialism or barbarism, for example, as the old slogan. I think we need to be quite frank in that barbarism, these are not, it's not an either or, we are living the elements of barbarism today. We can see this in Gaza. We can see this around the world, and the impact of the climate crisis in particular is going to accelerate. There's no doubt about that. So it does make the imperative of breaking with capitalism ever more important. However, I wouldn't be, I'm not pessimistic in the sense that I do think the kinds of illusions that people might have in what capitalism can and does deliver are being shattered. There is the capacity, I think, and the real possibility of seeing kind of mobilizations around the questions of oil and fossil fuels in meaningful ways. And I think as these effects of the climate crisis actually impact people on a day-to-day basis, whether it be through in urban spaces, whether it be through fires, whether it be through extreme weather patterns, we're going to see, I think, mobilization. So I think the important thing is to kind of be clear about what the problem is, and that tells us what needs to be done. And I think, as I say in the book, the kind of framework offered by the eco-socialist arguments, I think, to me, convincing, and really need to combine kind of fundamental change with these questions of ecology and fossil fuel, breaking with the fossil fuel system.
Well, thank you very much for your talk today, Adam, and your really systemic analysis. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody here to say that it was excellent and very much appreciated. So I look forward to uploading this video on the CSSGJ's website, YouTube page very soon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending, and
Thank you.
All the best. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you, Adam. Bye.
Thank you.